Hello,
Hello,
I'm
I'm
Joan
Joan
Redmond,
Retman, Area Community Relations Director for Era Living. Before we start today's presentation, Evaluating Retirement Living Options, I would like to share a little bit about the sponsor for today's event, which is the Gardens at Town Square. The Gardens at Town Square is one of 8 premier retirement communities owned and operated by Era Living, which is a very reputable local company of retirement communities in the Seattle area for the past 30-plus years. The Gardens is conveniently located near downtown Bellevue and is just steps away from wonderful amenities like the French Bakery, shops at the Bravern, the Bellevue Public Library, and just minutes from medical centers such as Overlake and Kaiser, and also all the great shops at Bellevue Square. The Gardens is known for its feeling of vibrancy and independence, its hospitality and lovely amenities, including one of the most beautiful and brightest dining rooms in the area, plus a very serene, private, and beautiful garden courtyard. The Gardens at Town Square features a wide variety of newly renovated apartments, including studio, 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom, and even a 3-bedroom option. You can check out the website to now see a new self-guided virtual tour for some of these floor plan styles. Now, whether you're looking for independent living, assisted living, or memory care services, the Gardens at Town Square might be the right fit for you. You may also appreciate knowing that if you move into the Gardens as an independent resident, you do not need to move to a different part of the community or a different apartment to receive assisted living services. We'll learn more about that in the presentation today. It's also known as the Flex License Model, so pay attention to when we get to that part. Tours are currently available with certain modifications, so you're always welcome to ask us about what they are when you're considering touring so that you can best prepare for your visit. And now we'll move on to the presentation for today, Evaluating Retirement Living Options. Once again, I'm Joan Retman, Area Community Relations Director for Era Living. And in my present and past roles within this industry for the past 13 years, my job has been to really serve as a guide to help families understand what residential retirement living options might be a good fit for them. And it's really been an honor for me to serve in this role because this really is one of the most important decisions that one may make in their life. Over the years, by working in a variety of different settings and different models, I've learned how all the terminology out there can be quite confusing to folks that are making decisions perhaps on limited information that they've gathered during the touring process, or that a number of things that aren't always evident or obvious to ask about. So I put myself on a mission really to educate everyone about the differences and to share some of these lessons learned that I've learned with the general public to hopefully help everyone make the most informed decision possible and to hopefully avoid some of the surprises, some of which I did witness firsthand over the years, that can happen when not everything is considered that perhaps should have been. And so today, this is what we're going to cover. We're going to talk a little bit about the different models that are out there, the financial contracts that are attached to each of those, pros and cons of each kind, the considerations. This is actually my favorite part, to talk about the top 10 considerations when making an informed decision, and how do you know if it's the right place and the right time to make the move. So let's get started diving in about the different senior living models. We're going to talk about 4 different types of models today. There are several others, which if we were to do all of them, we would need an entire day, a workshop of an entire day to go through all these. But for today, we're going to focus on what does retirement community mean? How does that compare to a continuing care retirement community, also known as the CCRC, the Flex License model, which we touched on already a little bit, and assisted living. So let's start with retirement community. And this is the most vague term out there. So this can be kind of confusing for a lot of people because they hear it attached to everything. And it really is meant to be just an umbrella term that at this point, retirement community is really just speaking to an age-restricted type of environment. Those age restrictions can vary. Some communities declare themselves as 55 and older, maybe at 62 and older, or 65 and older, but what they all have in common is that there's some sort of shared services and amenities. Where they might also differ is, do you purchase the home that you're moving into? Is it a condo? Is it a house? Is it an apartment of some sort? Or is it a rental option? So the first one that we're going to talk about in terms of retirement community is one that is strictly a 55 and older. And if you're seeing ones that are defined as 55 and older that are looking for kind of a younger age range, at least to start, those are the ones that really do not have any care attached to them at all. So they're meant to be just strictly for retirement, strictly for those 55 and older, and oftentimes do attract a younger demographic. So when looking at kind of the pros and cons of moving into a community that's designed like this, again, you have activities that are catered towards those of perhaps a similar age group and interest. Makes it very easy to participate in the social activities. So for a lot of people, this is the first step, maybe from downsizing from a 4,000 square foot home into a much smaller environment. It could be a house or maybe a 1,000 square foot apartment building to simplify their lives a little bit, reduce all of the maintenance and everything from such a large home. The downside to this, which this particular objection, you could say, is not necessarily unique specifically to a 55 and older community, but really all age-restricted communities. I've heard a lot of feedback over the years that a lot of people might be concerned about access to younger generations, where they commonly might say, I don't want to live around just a bunch of old people. I want to be able to have access to younger generations too. And if you feel that way, I think it's a good idea to ask those questions of each community that you're looking at, because it is quite possible that there might be more opportunities than you may realize to keep that engagement. There are some communities, for instance, that are even designed to have daycares inside of the communities, or they might have local partnerships with, say, the Girl Scouts or other groups that allow you to have those kinds of interactions. Or even a lot of schools, elementary age up to high school age, might have certain projects that they're working on where they want to be paired with different residents to do interviews and biographies and such, which can be a lot of fun. So depending on what your thoughts are there might be more access than you think. One of the other challenges of just a 55 and older type of design is that since care is not part of this design, if you do need care services at some point in the future, medication management, help with dressing, bathing, those kinds of things, there is a likelihood that once those increase to a certain point, you may need to move again to really be best served with those types of services. To start, sometimes bringing in home care may work to get the support that you need for a certain period of time, but as that continues to grow, it may require another move in the future. And depending on how much of a crisis you may be in at that time, so if it's a sudden health change, like a severe stroke where you need a lot of care, you might not have a lot of notice. Of course, it's a surprise, and that might mean it could be problematic if the type of 55 and older community you're in is one that you had purchased a property and you're relying upon those funds to pay for care, having to then prepare the home and sell it all at the same time while you're trying to plan the move can be a little challenging for some folks. So if you're not familiar with many 55 and older type of communities in the area, again, ones that don't have care but are just focused on independent living only. Some examples are Providence Point over in the Issaquah area. There are shag communities all over the place. Trilogy is another very large complex in the Redmond area. And then Rebel is one of the newest ones, which just opened recently in the Issaquah area. Now, if we want to compare that to a continuing care retirement community, or a CCRC, I'll add that there is a term that another term I'm going to throw in here, which is also part of the confusing terminology that I alluded to. Life plan is really the newest term that industry professionals are using to describe a CCRC. So those two terms are used pretty much interchangeably at this point. That's a new development if you haven't heard that before. I will make a note to not confuse life plan with life care, which is one type of a CCRC community that we're going to talk about shortly. So if you're not already confused, you might be confused very soon with learning about life care communities, but we'll try to clarify that in a moment. So within a CCRC, normally the age restrictions are now more like 62 and 65 and older, so starting with a slightly older demographic. And to be a true CCRC or life plan community, there are really 4 different types of living scenarios that are all segregated from one another. So independent living is in one part of the community, assisted living is in a different part, skilled nursing in another, and yet memory care in another. So it might be that all of the care is in a separate building that's attached to it, or perhaps it's on different floors or a different part of the campus, but they are all in different spaces, if you will, within the complex. Compared to just a standard retirement community that does not offer care, you tend to find a little bit more now in terms of the amenities or services that are offered. So maintenance, there's usually weekly housekeeping, or maybe it's housekeeping every 2 weeks. There's now going to be some part of a dining component that's included. It might be 1 meal a day, or it might be 2, it might be 25 meals a day, or based on a certain number of credits. All of them function a little bit differently. Transportation is also usually part of what's offered in a continuing care retirement community. It might be included in the rent, or there might be a fee, depending on each community. And activities, there tends to be a more robust activity schedule where there are multiple things that are going on between 5 to 7 days a week. The idea with a continuing care retirement community is that you start out by moving into the independent living section, and then if your health changes in the future, you would physically move to that location, which is applicable at some point down the road. So if you need assisted living services, you move out of your independent living apartment and over to the assisted living section. You would have priority access to this over, say, folks that are still living in their homes. So from the outside of the community who may suddenly need assisted living or memory care, they sometimes have the ability to move into a CCRC but bypass the independent route. However, they have priority under someone who had been living there independently already. Some communities that have smaller healthcare centers where these care levels are offered may not allow people from the outside to have access to those care levels. They might be closed, if you will, so that those spaces are reserved only for the independent residents to move over and access them when they need that. CCRCs typically also have a buy-in component, so there's usually some sort of upfront cost when you move into a community of some sort. CCRCs, since they have the full continuum of care, typically charge something equal to, say, the cost of purchasing a house or a condo in the Seattle area. So it's a large sum of money, but most of the time there's a refundable component to it. A lot of them might be 80%, it could be 90% or even 100% if it's a brand new community just opening. Some might be 50% refundable, or maybe even amortized, where over the course of time, you wouldn't have a refund that is owed to you if you live in the community long enough. So when there are variances in the amount that's refundable, usually it means that the higher the entrance fee that you pay, the more money that you get back. If you pay a smaller amount going in, that might also mean there's less money, or perhaps amortized in terms of what that refund would look like. Moving on to the different types of CCRCs, or again, life plan communities. This is where I hope to help make sense of the difference between life plan and life care. So I mentioned life care is one type of a CCRC. So with a life care community, again, you have the full continuum of care available to you. So let's say that you start out moving into independent living, and then you move into assisted living 3 years later. The idea is that you move from your independent apartment to assisted living, but the amount that you pay is going to either remain the same, or it might be just a small additional charge above what you had been paying while you were living independently. That applies to all care levels. So you pay the same for assisted living as you do for memory care, as you do for skilled nursing. And for those of you who might, by chance, be familiar with what the going rate is in the Seattle area for skilled nursing, this can be a pretty big deal, because if you have to pay out of pocket long-term for skilled nursing, it can be anywhere from $12,000 to $15,000 a month. So if you were living in a life care community, let's say that you had been paying $5,000 a month for your independent living apartment, and that same fee transfers with you. Say if you had a severe stroke and you needed skilled nursing on an ongoing basis, that's a big price difference, isn't it? $10,000 per month, potentially. It is important to understand that for these types of contracts, a life care contract, they do have to be selective in who they offer it to. So there is a pretty thorough health screening, medical screening before you move in, where pre-existing conditions may potentially disqualify you. So if you have a diagnosis like Parkinson's or MS, or there's a dementia diagnosis, there's a fairly good chance that that particular community would not approve that financial benefit of that life care contract, because it's too likely that you would need that long-term care in the future, and potentially for quite a long period of time. So it's sort of like if any of you have applied for a long-term care insurance policy where you have the health screening questions and such, you have to be able to be healthy enough in order to receive that benefit. So very similar concept for this type of a program. And that is because it does serve like a long-term care insurance policy, doesn't it? Because if you need that care in the future, again, it's discounted drastically off market rate. And it's for the duration of the time that you're there, too. So they don't even write long-term care insurance policies like that anymore, where you can have a lifetime benefit. A couple of examples of a life care community. There are only 3 that are in this area. I have 2 of them listed on the slide here. Emerald Heights is the first one in Redmond area, which is over 30 years old now, Timber Ridge at Tallis, and then also Skyline at First Hill, which is in downtown Seattle, were 2 that opened around the same time, I want to say 2008, 2009 for the 2 of them. The only other life care community that's in this area is around the Gig Harbor and Olympia area. Otherwise, there's just 3 in this area. Now, if we move to a Type B contract, which is also called a modified contract, a couple of examples of these would be like Mirabella or Park Shore. Those are over on the west side. Park Shore is Lake Washington, Mirabella, South Lake Union. These communities have the same care levels as the life care levels have, but the financial benefits are a little different. So if you move from independent living to one of the care levels there, there's going to be some financial benefits, but it has limitations to it. And this is where it's a little trickier to understand, so you want to make sure that you get these contracts in advance to read through them, or give them to an attorney to read through, to make sure you know exactly what care levels it applies to and for how long. So for instance, one of them might have a contract that says that you will receive a discount on assisted living services, but it's for 60 days, or maybe it's a year, but it doesn't apply to the other care levels, or there might be variances between the care levels. So again, it can be confusing, but read the contract to know what those limitations might be. With a Type C contract, these are also called a fee-for-service type of CCRC. Most of the other CCRCs in this area fall under the fee-for-service category, where it's a pretty black and white contract. So you start out independent just the same. You move to the appropriate spot in the community for higher care just the same. But the difference here is that you would be paying the market rate or the going rate for when you need care. And in a lot of cases here, you're actually paying a smaller entrance fee or a smaller buy-in. So you pay a smaller amount coming in, and then you're paying market rate when you need the care in the future. If we want to talk for a couple minutes about pros and cons of a life plan community, again, CCRC in general, one of the highest benefits that we talked about is a lot of people like the idea of those 4 different living scenarios being under the same roof or on the same campus, where it feels as though you have all of your needs covered no matter what might change in the future. This gives a lot of people great peace of mind knowing this. Also that there's priority access to care. That feels really good, knowing that I'm taken care of if I need something. The financial protection, so those discounts on care, especially for a type A, and to a certain degree a type B, can feel really good, feeling like you have a long-term care insurance policy built in essentially. And for many of the CCRC contracts, there's also a benevolent fund, meaning that if you run out of money at some point in the future, there's a promise to take care of you. And sometimes I get questions like, well, that maybe makes me a little nervous going into a CCRC. What if half the people that are living there run out of money? How is the community going to stay financially viable? But rest assured, there is a financial qualification process before you move into a community like this. So each community makes sure that there's a lot of cushion, a lot of assets in reserve, if you will, to be able to ensure that the residents moving in are financially sound and viable. And there is language in the contracts where you can't gift all of your money away after you move in, so suddenly you have none shortly after moving in. So they make sure there's a lot of financial protection around it so that it's safe, so that almost never happens. The other benefit is that because you're paying so much going in, that oftentimes the monthly rates are lower than when you're comparing this to an option that is referred to as a month-to-month option, which we'll talk about shortly. The downside of a CCRC, there's a few things to talk about here, and I think that the one that I want to focus on the most is actually this first bullet point, which a lot of people really do struggle with having to move out of that independent apartment when it really comes down to it. So in my experience from the time when I personally did work in a CCRC, a lot of prospective new residents loved looking at the independent side of the community. They loved the possibility of their new apartment, and they liked the idea that there would be care there in the future if they really needed it. But it surprised me how many people didn't really want to spend that much time looking into that side and exploring what those apartments would look like and really what that side of the community would look like in general. And so after about 5 years having worked in a CCRC, you can imagine that a lot of people had developed needs for assisted living or higher care after that period of time had passed. And when it came to time to making the move, there were actually quite a few people that chose to bring in home care and stay in that independent apartment instead of move to the part of the community where that care was offered, because they didn't like the idea of living in a new space, a different space, having different accesses there for amenities like different dining services and activities and such. It was too much of a change in a way, so it was surprising. In another downside might be if you happen to be a couple, that this might mean that a couple needs to really split, where one person would be staying in the independent side if you remain independent. The other person who starts to need care services now is intended to move to that part of the community. There's also, I think it's also important to know that although it's rare that the community would say no to an independent resident, just know that there still needs to be an assessment that takes place from the nursing team before they can say, yes, we will take you into assisted living or memory care or whatnot. They have to do a medical assessment to make sure that you're the right fit. So it's important to know that because you pass the initial medical exam when you move in as an independent resident, it's not a guarantee that under all circumstances you can move into the higher level of care. It's rare that they would say no, but I actually did see it happen one time while I was working in a community during those 5 years. So I do feel it's important to at least be aware of that and have that conversation before moving in so you understand more about what that might look like. I had touched on this next point already, that you might not have access to the independent amenities anymore, different dining room, different activities. It can feel like a completely different community especially if there is a completely separate building for all of the care services. The design can affect how much you have access to. That's the same as before you made the move while you were living in independent living. Others have mentioned that they might feel a little challenged financially by having to pay such a large amount coming into a community as opposed to keeping those funds in their own control where they can invest those in the way that they wish. So it's a personal preference in terms of managing your finances. It's also important to know that the funds that come back to you, so that refundable portion of your entrance fee, typically does not come back to you until you've moved out and that apartment has been re-rented or resold, however you want to view it, to the next person coming in. You know, even during COVID, CCRCs in this area have done really well, so I wouldn't worry too much about that in the Seattle area. Maybe other parts of the country might be a little bit different, but I don't think the real estate market here is doing so well. I don't think that's too much of a concern here. But the biggest point is to remember, as we just talked about a little earlier, that pre-existing conditions may qualify that admission. So if you're really focused on a life care type of a community or a CCRC in general, you want to be aware that if you wait too long and health conditions arise, there's a really good chance you might miss that window. So switching gears to a flex license model, these are typically communities that operate mostly on a month-to-month contract, meaning that there's a small community fee that you pay, not the big buy-in that we talked about. So community fee might be closer to 1 month's rent or maybe even a little bit less than that. So $2,000, $4,000, $10,000, depending on the community. And then you move into the apartment. If you move in as an independent resident, then if you need assisted living services in the future, you actually stay in that same apartment. So there isn't a separate part of the community where you move for assisted living services. This is because there are a designated number of apartments that can be licensed for assisted living at any given time, which means that you have one community and any apartment can be independent or assisted living really at any given time. So it's more of a inclusive type of a design, I would say. There is not segregation, and this means that you have one dining room that serves the whole population, activities that serve the whole population. All amenities are applicable to everyone that lives in the community. One exception to that might be if there is also memory care in that community, such as at the Gardens at Town Square is an example of that, where there is the flex license concept in the general part of the community. So again, independent and assisted exists there. There is a special neighborhood known as the Terrace where there are 26 private apartments there for those who need services related to advancing memory loss. That would be the exception of having the move. So the other thing that I'll mention with this type of model is that normally this type of model is also focused on a vibrant, independent type of activity program and design. So there are normally a higher number of independent living residents in this model in the general side of the community than assisted living. The goal is for somebody to move in independent, although someone could move in with needing light assisted living needs. So typically the ratios, in case you're curious, with a lot of companies that do this model, kind of the goal is for about 70% of the residents living in the community to be independent and about 30% utilizing assisted living services at any given time. So of course that fluctuates, but that's generally what the model is designed to be like. So there are several examples of this flex license concept here in the Seattle area. It actually began from efforts between Era Living and University of Washington. So that's kind of a fun fact. We're working together and interviewing retirees, specifically from the University of Washington's Retirement Association. It was discovered that if given a choice, that seniors would prefer to not have to do multiple moves, that they would prefer to move into one apartment, preferably independent, and then receive assisted living services in that same apartment. And so the flex license model was created by Era Living 30 years ago, and then it's evolved over time since then. So there are a lot of other companies now that saw value in that, such as Merrill Gardens. Any leisure care community like Fairwinds also do that. All 8 Era Living communities use the flex license model. So we're happy to share more examples for you if you'd like. So looking at the pros and cons, we already talked a little bit about the pros. A lot of people love being able to stay in place and have that inclusive culture where you have the same access to all of the same amenities. You continue to live around the same people, same friends that you have. You're obviously paying a lot less coming into the community with a community fee as opposed to the buy-in or the entrance fees. The downside is that by paying a smaller amount going in, you pay a higher amount on a month-to-month type of arrangement. The monthly fees are higher. And because you don't have the full continuum of care typically in a flex license, you don't typically have skilled nursing as part of it, for instance, it does mean that there is a chance that the care that you might need in the future, even if it is remote, it might mean perhaps another move in the future if your care needs move into, say, needing 2-person assistance or a Hoyer lift or something else that requires a lot of medical attention that maybe only a skilled nursing can provide. And because there is no buy-in, there's no large lump sum that you're paying coming in, there also are not the same financial qualifications that are required, and therefore no benevolent fund is offered in these types of contracts. Moving to assisted living. So if you're not familiar with this term, which I think most people are, assisted living refers to things like help with activities of daily living, like grooming, dressing, bathing, and such. And these services are typically provided by a certified nursing assistant, as opposed to nurses. So nursing assistants or CNAs do the majority of this type of work. So you typically find them in communities around the clock, 24/7, where nurses are typically available less than that, usually 8 hours a day, maybe 12 hours a day, between 5 and 7 days a week is pretty common. Many of them are on call if they're not inside the building during evening hours. Assisted living can be part of a CCRC like we talked about, or it can be a standalone type of design too, where all of the apartments in the entire community are already licensed for assisted living. Oftentimes those are paired with memory care, so you see the two of them together a lot of times. So some examples of those where assisted living communities are paired with memory care would be Sunrise and Aegis are two of the biggest names in this area. Patriots Glen is also pretty close to us too. When we look at the top 10 most overlooked considerations, again, this is the section that I'd like to spend a little bit more time on because there are a number of things here that have popped up in my experience that are not necessarily things that people normally think of, or they're thinking of it a slightly different way than you could look at it. So we're going to go through this list for the next few minutes. The first one is the pre-existing conditions part of it. And I can't emphasize how important this one is enough, because any community that does not just focus on assisted living, but rather has an independent living component to it, does have some sort of admission criteria. And I feel like a lot of people aren't aware of this. So they assume that, well, I'm going to go ahead and stay in my house for as long as I want to, or until I just can't stay because I need so much help that I can't live in my home anymore, I can't do stairs, I need a lot of care with assisted living. It is quite possible that if you wait until that point, you might very well miss that admission window for many of the communities that you maybe had hoped to move into, and that you could have if you had moved in while you were independent. And then the same circumstances developed later on, you could have then added that care on while you're inside the community. So it is important to make sure that when you're looking at communities and you're developing a list of the ones that you like, make sure you have it broken down so you understand which ones have certain admission criteria where you need to move in independently or close to it versus which ones you can wait longer, so that at least you have a backup plan in place if your health changes and now you need care, you know to rule out these, and you can focus on these communities here. The local owners and managers piece, I'm not saying that that is what you need to focus on, are ones that have local owners and managers, but I do think it's important to ask questions about it, especially if they are two different groups of people or two different establishments. So if you have both local ownership and they are also managing the communities, a lot of times they're on the same page. There's a long history of that relationship, of course, and that can sometimes mean greater consistency with the services, care, and staffing. There are some cases that I've been aware of within the past 5 years or so where there are different owners than the managers. There's been a lot of turnover in some communities in the Seattle area over the past several years, where because of that, the new management team coming in has their own set of ideas, for instance, on services and what staffing should look like and such. And for a lot of residents, that either had shaken things up a little bit, where that had even caused some of them to want to relocate to a different community because they were feeling like they weren't getting what they had originally bought into, so to speak, when they first moved in. So my recommendation there would just be to ask, when you're looking at communities, have there been any changes in ownership or management over the past, say, 5 years or even 10 years? And if the answer is yes, ask a few more questions to find out what changes have happened, how many of those have happened. But for those specifically, I would definitely recommend, before making a decision, to ask to be able to be connected with a number of different residents that have been living in the community, especially those that have been living there during that time frame when those changes have happened, to find out, okay, how have those changes affected what it's been like living there in that community. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It could be a great thing that the change happened, but it's important to dig deeper and make sure that you understand that, and to possibly understand if there may be yet another change in the near future. That would be important. With for-profit versus not-for-profit, the point that I just want to make there is that you can find guides online and in various places that can give you a list of questions to ask when you're touring retirement communities, and those can be very helpful too. But a lot of times this question is on there. Ask if it's a for-profit and not-for-profit, but it doesn't necessarily give you information about why that's important and how that could be important for some, but maybe not for other people. And the example that I'll use here is that even for my own parents who are living in Minnesota right now, they're being served with home care for various reasons. They live in a rural part of the state. And for me, looking at the types of services that could be not-for-profit were not as important as just making sure that my mom in particular was having her needs met. After doing a lot of research, I chose a company that is a for-profit, but I felt like the services provided definitely equal the value for what I was paying. And so my encouragement would be that when you're comparing a variety of different communities, to use that lens more so than I only want to look at not-for-profits or whatnot. Because all companies out there, they need to make some money in order to move forward. And not-for-profits aren't necessarily ones that are the budget friendliest, if that makes sense. So there are a number of reasons to choose a community. That's just one way to measure it, and be sure to ask more questions before making a decision just based on that alone, I would say. The next one a lot of people are not aware of, so state surveys. What this means is that when any community is licensed to provide care, they have to have licensure through the state of Washington. So the Department of Social and Health Services, or DSHS, comes in every 12 to 18 months for every community that is licensed to provide assisted living services. And they do inspections, which they call surveys, but they do inspections to take a look at all of the components to the community, the record keeping, making sure they're checking various files to see what the response time is for call buttons that are pushed, or are there any concerns from the residents themselves? So they do resident interviews, everything from that to how cleanly is the building itself Is it in disrepair? And they generate a report on this. This is information that you, the general public, has access to, and you might not have even known that. So you can always ask for a copy of that state survey. The community should be able to provide that to you when you ask for it. They could email it to you, or when you're inside the community touring, they should be able to grab and make a copy for you. It's very reasonable to ask for this, and all communities should know this, that they should be prepared to give you a copy of this upon request. With staff ratios and longevity, I think a number of people assume that, well, it definitely makes sense to focus on communities that have a long history of their staff working there, and that the staff to resident ratios look really good, that there's a lot of staff in relationship to the number of residents that are living there. So a couple points that I'll make to that. With the staff ratios, it's actually more important to understand how those ratios relate to the demographic of the population that's there. So for instance, in the gardens inside our the terrace, which is where our memory care part of our community is, you might see more like a 1-to-6 ratio for the ratio of the CNAs, those that provide the care, to the number of residents there. And that sounds really good, doesn't it? 1-to-6, that's pretty good. On the general side of the community, it's going to be quite different than that. And especially if we have, 70% of the residents that are independent and not needing any care services, you're not going to need nearly that many people staffed, maybe just a few, to provide care for the residents that are living there, because if it's entirely independent residents, you don't need those types of services. So making sure you understand what that resident mix looks like might be helpful if you're trying to evaluate if that's good or not. But the state surveys can give you some clues too. So if the surveys are coming out great, they're not making any mistakes, and you have a chance to talk with a number of residents before making decisions, that will be maybe an even more important clue on if the staff ratios are looking pretty good. With the longevity piece, what I do want to mention is that those that are in the director roles, that might be more of the significant areas to look at if there's longevity there. For other team members, you might see some turnover, and that might be okay to see that turnover. So for instance, there are a number of different communities that work with, say, neighboring schools like the University of Washington or other schools that have nursing programs, where there's a partnership where a lot of their CNAs come from the school, but they have aspirations to grow into nurses, doctors, or others in the medical field. And so they might be coming and going in between, getting their education, going to school, or advancing throughout their career. And that might be just the very person that you want to take care of you, as someone who's aspiring to grow in that field. So you might not see much longevity for those folks. It's important to know that. With the next point, age of community or the company, how the reputation is important. I think it's helpful to know if there's a brand new community opening, which there are a lot of. You probably noticed in the Seattle area, east side and west side, there's a lot of growth happening right now. And one of the things that I would recommend paying attention to is it the first community, or one of the very first of a company that is building new communities in the area, or is it a company that actually has a long history of communities? And so this is just one of maybe 20 or 30 or something like that that's in the portfolio. So it's less of a experiment, maybe for lack of a better word. When new communities open, there are always things that need to be worked through. There's always new team members coming together, and it takes a little bit for that to really become a well-oiled machine. That would be the downside of comparing brand new communities to ones that are more established, is it takes time to get in your rhythm. Even if you have experienced staff that are coming together, they may not have worked together before, and definitely not in that new environment. So if there's a longer history and a good reputation of the company, that means more than one that's maybe brand new. I might put less emphasis on focusing on a brand new company that's building a new community than one that's been around for a while. The size of the company can make a difference too. So there are some that you hear a lot in the news that have hundreds and hundreds of communities all across the country. versus ones that maybe have more of a local focus. And it can make a difference. What I would do is just ask more questions to find out how much autonomy each community really does have, or do they really use just a blanket approach for economies of scale purposes for establishing their activities, their dining programs and such? How much do they let each community customize and personalize it for their residents is really the point here. With the next point of family or outside providers being allowed to provide care, this can be a really important one for some families who maybe have been involved in maybe their parents' care for a while, maybe helping set up the medisets, the pill boxes, for instance. If that's important, some communities will allow that, some won't, depending on the way that the license is structured. So asking those questions before making decisions can be important. Don't just make assumptions that because you've been doing things a certain way that can continue, or that if you hear an answer for one community that you're applying it to the next. You want to ask all of these questions to each community when making a decision. Ease of terminating the contract if your situation changes. So if you find yourself in a situation where maybe you're wanting to live closer to, say, your adult children, and your adult children might have the type of job that means that they might need to move around a lot, that might be something you'd want to consider to maybe not look at CCRCs as opposed to month-to-month or community fee type of arrangements, because month-to-month is month-to-month. You give 20 to 30 days notice depending on the community, and then you move on. Whereas the buy-in, again, that can be tied up for some time depending on where you're living before you get that money back to be able to apply to a new situation. The last point I want to spend a little bit of time on, the moving more than once piece. That's a comment that I've heard so many times over the past 13 years that a lot of people say that it's really important that they don't want to have to move again. And I definitely hear that point, and I think most everybody would say that they would agree with that. Ideally, that would be the scenario. But I do want to take that a step further and think about how that compares between two of the different models. So when you're thinking about that concept and you're thinking then I need to just focus on a CCRC, that's the reason why, because they have all of the care levels there, and if something ever changes, I'm covered, versus moving into a month-to-month environment where there's a chance that you might have to move again because there isn't skilled nursing there, and in some cases not memory care depending on the community. There's a little bit more risk involved. But I just ask to process that a little bit more. So for instance, if you're comparing the two and the month-to-month option, you've spent a lot of time in, you love the residents that are there, you feel like you have a lot in common with them, they are a good match in terms of their level of independence compared to yours, the food is to your liking, you've met a lot of the leadership team, all of that feels perfect to you. And maybe you don't even have pre-existing conditions that point towards the fact that, maybe you won't need care in the future with assisted living or memory care. There's nothing in your health history that says you're very likely to need that. But if you're giving up those perfect matches for the CCRC concept only because you might have to move again because maybe you don't like the food as much, the residents are not as much of a match for you, and so on, I would ask to maybe possibly reconsider the decision to commit to CCRC, because remember, with a CCRC, you have to actually move anyway. So again, you do have to give up that independent living apartment to move to the higher levels of care, which for some people, again, it feels like you're moving into a different community anyway. If you're giving up the apartment, the amenities, the activities, the dining room and such, it's not that much different moving 500 feet down the hall to this new apartment than if you're living in this a month-to-month model that's so perfectly suited for you up until the point when it isn't. And then if you need to move, there would be professionals to help you find the right fit. Maybe you move 2 miles away instead of 500 feet away, comparing the two options. But if it means living so perfectly suited versus I don't really like the community that much, but just in case something changes, that's just the point of view that I'm recommending, that the lens that you put on, I should say, that I recommend before you make a final decision, if that's your criteria. A few other things to consider. The financial piece, again, if you already have long-term care insurance, maybe that would make a difference with the financial model that you consider. Or if you need a type of community that offers Medicaid, many of them do have spend down requirements. So it's important to know that if it looks like you have limited resources and you don't have very many years left of private funds, to know that most communities that do offer Medicaid, which many of those are very hard to find, there aren't a lot of communities in the area that offer it, but for those that do, many of them do require that you might need to pay 2 years or 3 years or 4 years privately first, and then once you've met those requirements, then you can roll over into the Medicaid program. There are almost always annual rent increases, so this doesn't always come up in conversation during the touring process, so definitely add that to your list to ask what to expect. In the Seattle area, most of the time it's going to be between 3 and 6% for most communities, but some can actually be more, especially if they're brand new communities and they're ramping up and their expenses are going up. You might possibly see more there, but ask. The other thing that can be important to some when making a decision is what other kinds of services might be readily available, either on site or within the surrounding neighborhood, like access to social workers, pharmacists, podiatrists, primary care, and other services like that. So now when we want to take a look at how do I know if this is the right fit for me personally, I think it's really important to make sure you have a realistic understanding of your own situation. So again, looking at any pre-existing conditions that you might have or present needs to make sure that you're focusing on the right communities that can provide that right support for you. To also look at more than just the average age of the residents, but actually to meet residents and to understand what the model is like. So again, independent focused communities are designed differently than those that have entirely assisted living for the focus. So for the ones that focus on independent living, you might expect maybe there are 85-year-olds as the average age there, but they're very vibrant and engaged and cognizant, where a community that's focused entirely on assisted living might have 80-year-olds as the average age. So it might even be a younger demographic. But if they're focused on heavier care, that might not be a match for you if you are independent. So focusing on age isn't necessarily the best criteria, in my opinion. So to understand if it's the right fit for you, spend time in the community, attend events where you can, have meals where you can. If you can do a guest stay, if that's an option, do that, and talk to the residents to get the feeling if you feel like you're the right match there or not. During COVID, this can be a little trickier because of the restrictions, which are starting to lift a little bit, depending on the community, of course, and the design. You can always ask us what that looks like at the time that you might feel like you're ready to tour, but there are opportunities even now to experience these in different ways. Definitely ask about care limitations. So again, if you have those pre-existing conditions, know how they might support you down the road when your health conditions develop to needing some care. And again, if you're touring the CCRCs, like the type A, B, and C that we talked about earlier, be sure to visit all of those care levels before you make a final decision so that you don't run into the situation where it's time to move and then suddenly, oh gosh, I didn't realize the assisted living looked like that or felt like that. I don't want to move there, but now you find yourself in a situation where you have to make a decision to make the move from independent living or to bring in home care. So my advice is to tour the whole community in a CCRC before making a decision for sure. Now for timing, how do you know if it's the right time to make a move? So this is just kind of a checklist to kind of process, and again, it might be helpful to get a copy of this presentation so you can even have this printed at home to review when you have a little bit more time, but kind of comparing your life now to maybe 5 years ago. Have you started to notice some changes with yourself, with health conditions, anything standing out there? how you might envision what 5 years from now might look like, especially if you have a pre-existing condition. Are you really just kind of surviving in your home right now, or are you really thriving and getting your nutrition needs met, your, getting your exercise that you need? Are you having social opportunities that you need? That's what thriving is about. How is that fulfilling your needs now versus in the past? Are you living off of processed foods and microwavable meals, which for some people they always have, and that's a choice. That's fine. Or is that a change in your lifestyle where you're doing that because it's just what works to get by, because it's too difficult to make healthier choices if that's what you would really prefer? For those that are caregiving for a spouse or a partner, has that really taken over your primary identity and replaced the more spousal relationship that you had once had with the caregiving type of role? Have there been any health scares recently, like a fall, within the past year that indicate there's something that might happen again in the near future? If you've had a diagnosis of MCI, which stands for mild cognitive impairment, this is a precursor that oftentimes leads to dementia. That would be important to consider for timing, for making a move. And then how would this affect time with your family? If it means moving now, maybe before you truly feel ready, but you have more time with your family because you're moving closer to them, that could be something to consider. So moving on to really basically the last slide or so here, my advice would be to consider moving now if you're feeling any of these things or a combination of these things, like feeling lonely, that you're not getting the socialization that you need, that you might be caregiving for someone and you'd really prefer to just spend time with them like you used to, and to turn the caregiving responsibilities over to another team, if you will. If you are needing help with activities of daily living, but you don't really feel comfortable with, due to either privacy reasons, bringing someone into your home, or if it's extensive and the cost of home care can easily exceed the cost of living in an assisted living environment. If you do have a diagnosis that points towards the fact that you'll need care in the future, I would seriously consider moving sooner rather than later. The cost of maintaining a home, that can be very extensive for some. If you're someone who just naturally has anxiety, especially about the what ifs, what if my daughter isn't able to come over this week and set up my pillboxes for me? Or what if the maintenance guy who hurt himself by falling off a ladder last weekend doesn't recover in time to be able to come over and take care of my leaking roof? Those kinds of things. If you're prone to worry about those kinds of things, there's so much peace of mind that can happen by moving into an environment where all of those maintenance pieces are taken care of for you. So just having peace of mind can be one of the most valuable reasons for making a move like this. So we've actually reached the point where we can start looking at taking any questions. So I'm going to pause for a minute and look at the chat feature and see if any of those questions have popped up. In the meantime, if you'd like, you're welcome to use the chat feature to type in some questions. And knowing that using chat on Zoom can be a little tricky for some people, we might even go ahead and unmute your mics, or you could also possibly do that yourself if you're familiar with it, to just go ahead and voice your question at this time too. So let's actually go ahead and do that. So if you would like to ask a question, what you could do is raise your hand also. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here, if I can, so I can see you all a little bit better. There we go. Okay, so we can do one of two things. For those who are on camera, you can raise your hand if you have a question and I can call on you. If you're not on camera, you can use the chat, or you can put yourself back on camera by turning on your video so I can see you and call on you. So I'm looking at chat. I'm not seeing other questions pop up that haven't already been answered. Okay, I see a question. I see a couple. So I'm going to start with David. David Werner?
Yes.
Feel free to ask your question.
You indicated we could get copies of the slides of this presentation. That would be very, very helpful if we could do that.
Okay. Is
Okay,
email okay for you, David?
that would be fine, yes.
Okay. Would everybody like a copy? You can just nod your heads if that's it. Yeah, okay, we'll send it to everybody. We'll plan on that, okay? That's good. And Gemma, I think you had a question?
I do. I don't know if you've addressed this because I had to be late, but, and if you can answer the questions about costs, but how does the assisted living costs go? Do you have a basic amount that you pay to be on assisted living besides your monthly payments? And then is it charged according to what services you have each month, or how does that work?
That's a really great question. We've not covered that, so that's a good question for us to talk about. The answer is that it can vary a little bit depending on which community that you're looking into. There are some communities that have it set up on kind of a tiered structure, so it's sort of a flat amount based into 2 or 3 or 4 tiers where they do an assessment, and if you fall anywhere within a certain range, you might be charged this tier pricing, and then a higher range for tiers 2, 3, 4, or however it's structured. There are other communities that have it structured on more of an a la carte type of basis, which I think would represent most of the communities that do assisted living. So they take a look at each activity of daily living. There's quite a long list, you know, dressing, grooming, bathing, medications, and such. And they look at the frequency of that need and the duration of time. So it really comes down to an equivalent of time, essentially. And that equals a certain amount of a monthly charge is what most do. Some are different, but most. And then that's added on to your base rent. So most of the time it is customized and can definitely be different from one person to the next. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. Okay, anybody else have any questions that they'd like to ask over Zoom today? Okay, all right. So I think what we'll do, I'm not seeing other questions. I'm going to check chat just one more time. I don't see other questions there either. So again, understanding the challenges with Zoom, it can be kind of awkward. Oh, David, I'm coming back to you.
Sorry, yes, I'm interested in getting, can you give us a, something like a copy of the various floor plans and what the base cost is for each of those?
For the gardens at Town Square specifically?
Yes.
Yes, yeah, I can get you that information, you bet. Yeah.
Okay, I'd appreciate that.
Okay, great. So what we'll do, I know it works sometimes better for a lot of people just to have a phone conversation after webinars like this to be able to get a chance to ask your own personal questions. So you're always welcome to call us, but it's good to expect to within the next, you know, day or 2 or 3 days or so that you'll likely hear from either Ann Dingwall or myself. So Ann, I'm going to have you wave for a second. There's Ann. So many of you already know Ann, but it'll be either Ann or myself that'll do the follow-up calls to each of you to see if there are other questions that are just easier to talk over the phone. But we'll go ahead and email all this information to you, the slides. So you have that, so feel free to print that out and we'll go from there. Also, one other reminder, thank you, Juliana. Juliana, our Community Relations Associate, she doesn't have a camera on her today. Otherwise, we'd have her do a little wave. She's waving across the desk there at you. You can't see her yet, but she will also be emailing a survey out to you too. So again, this is a opportunity to share some feedback about what was helpful for you for this particular webinar, or if there's anything that you had hoped to learn about that you didn't, or anything you'd want to be different. That information is really helpful for us because even though we've had our second vaccination now, by the way, at the gardens, if you're not aware, that's great news, but there are still restrictions that might be in place for a while. We go by the governor's guidance for that. And so that means that we'll probably be doing webinars like this for some time before we can invite everybody to come back in and have in-person types of events and tours. So it's really helpful for us to know if there's anything else that you're interested in also in terms of subject matter, and then we'll do our best to see if we can cover that too. So I think what we'll do then is go ahead and conclude for today. And I just want to thank you again for joining us, and we'll be following up with you again soon. So thanks again so much for your time. Really appreciate it. Take care, everyone.